Hi everybody, welcome back to our 11.2 notes. We're going to do our last 5 example problems where we are completing the square. These ones will be a little bit more interesting and have a little bit more to them than the last ones. Okay, so first one we have in part C is 4k squared minus 24k plus 11 equals 0. First thing hopefully you notice is that there's a coefficient in front of your k squared. There's a 4 here. And we really need to deal with that first. I can't emphasize that enough. Divide by 4 on both sides so to get rid of that, okay? Okay? So 4k squared divided by 4 would be k squared minus 24k divided by 4 is 6k plus 11 divided by 4 is 11 fourths equals 0 divided by 4, which is 0. Okay. Next up, we're going to get it set up to complete the square. So I'm going to keep my k squared and my minus 6k over here. I'll have a plus blank so that I have a blank spot to complete the square. And then I'm going to subtract 11 fourths from both sides just to get it out of the way. Alright, completing the square. I'm going to look at my middle term, which is a negative 6k. I know the k comes from the k squared. So now I'm looking at the negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. Squared would be negative 3 times negative 3, which is positive 9. Okay? And whatever you add to the left side, we need to add to the right side as well. Okay? Then we're ready to factor. So this is going to factor out nicely because we made it into a perfect square trinomial. So the square root of k is k. We'll have the same sign as the middle, which is a minus. The square root of 9 is 3. And the whole thing is squared. So it's k minus 3 squared. It's k minus 3 times k minus 3 to get back to where we were. Okay. On the right side, we do have a fraction, so normal fraction operation rules apply. We do need a least common denominator to add our fractions. Okay, so we have negative 11 over 4. My LCD would be 4. And 9 over 1, if it helps your brain a little bit, would be, you multiply by 4 on the top and the bottom to get to that LCD. 9 times 4 is 36. Okay? Then we can add those together, so negative 11 fourths plus 36 fourths, or if you want to think about it as 36 minus 11, would be 25 fourths. And that equals our k minus 3 squared. Okay. Then to get rid of the squaring, we're going to take the square root of both sides. Okay. So the square root and the squaring will undo each other. You'll just be left with k minus 3 on the left side. On the right side, this is actually a perfect square, which is exciting. The square root of 25 is 5. And the square root of 4 is 2. Don't forget that when we take that square root, we do need the plus or minus version. Okay? So positive or negative 5 halves. Okay? Then to get k by itself, we're just going to add 3 to both sides and be done. So then we'll have k equals 3 plus 5 halves, or we could have 3 minus 5 halves. Okay? And since 5 halves is a nice, pretty rational number, it's not irrational, it's not stuck in the square root, we can go ahead and add those things together and simplify it a little bit further. Okay? So 3, you guys might know that 3 is equal to 6 over 2. So then we'll have 6 halves plus 5 halves, which would be 11 halves. Or we would have 6 halves minus 5 halves, which would be 1 half. So those are my two answers. So k could be 11 halves, or k could be 1 half. Okay. Next up, in part D, we have y squared plus 8y equals negative 21. So we're set up and ready to go for completing the square, okay? So we'll have y squared plus 8y plus blank, leave a space for completing our square, equals negative 21. complete the square, let's look at the middle term, the 8y. So y again comes from the y squared, but let's look at our 8. 8 divided by 2 would be 4. 4 squared would be 16. Whatever you add to one side, we need to add to both sides so that it stays equivalent. On the left side, this is going to factor nicely. The square root of y is y. We're just going to have a plus just like the middle sign. The square root of 16 is 4, and the whole thing is squared. On the right side, negative 21 plus 16 is negative 5. Okay, to solve for y, I want to get rid of the squaring. The opposite of squaring would be square rooting, so we're going to square root both sides, and we'll get y plus 4 equals plus or minus, so positive or negative square root of negative 5. Now the square root of negative 5 may be having a little bit of anxiety over there with the negative inside of a square root, but we know what to do with those. We just need to pull it out and make it into an I. So now I'll have y plus 4 equals positive or negative I square root of 5. Last but not least, we need to get y by itself. So to get rid of the plus 4, we just need to subtract it from both sides. So y will equal negative 4 plus or minus I square root of 5. And that's it. Okay. The next one we have in part E is r times r minus 5 equals negative 1. This one you'll notice it's not really in the same format as all the other ones. It's not in that standard form. We need to multiply it out first to see what we have. Okay, so r times r would be r squared, and r times minus 5 would be minus 5r. Okay, from here, let's go ahead and set it up for completing the square. I'll go ahead and do a plus blank, and equals negative 1. Okay, so our middle term is negative 5r. Half of that would be 5 halves, and squaring that would be 5 squared over 2 squared. So 5 squared is 25 over 2 squared, which is 4. Okay. Whatever I add on the left side, I also need to add on the right side. So I'm going to also add a 25/4 on the right side. Okay. The left side, how does that one factor? So the square root of r squared would be r. I'll have a minus, just like the middle term. The square root of 25/4, the square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 2. And it's squared. Or if it helps you guys, you can also just do half of that middle term, which is nice, without the variable, because the variable went with the first term, okay? But you can take the coefficient here and do 5 over 2, and that'll be the other part of your factoring as well. On the right side, we've got fractions again, okay? So our LCD yet again is 4. Negative 1 would be negative 4/4, and then we're adding 25/4. Okay? And negative 4/4 plus 25/4, that's the same thing as 25/4 minus 4/4. 25 minus 4 would be 21. So I've got 21/4 on the right side, and r minus 5 halves squared on the left side. Okay. Next up, let's get rid of the squaring. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. The square root and the squaring are going to undo each other, so that'll be r minus 5 halves on the left. On the right side, we do need to do the plus or minus square root. 21's not going to simplify. That's 3 times 7. So we'll have the square root of 21. The square root of 4 does simplify, though. That's a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. Okay. Last but not least, let's get r by itself and add 5 halves to both sides. So r is going to equal a positive 5 halves plus or minus the square root of 21 over 2. Or if you want to write that as one big fraction, you could also do 5 plus or minus the square root of 21 all over 2. Both of those are fine. It's your pick. Last one for the day is 5t squared minus 15t plus 12 equals 0. And this one, again, you're going to notice a coefficient in front of your t squared. Deal with it first, okay? So that means that we're going to divide everything by 5. 5t squared divided by 5 would be t squared minus 15t divided by 5 would be 3t plus 12 divided by 5 is just 12/5 equals 0 divided by 5, which would be 0. Okay, let's get that set up for completing the square. So I'm going to keep my t squared and my minus 3t over here. I'm going to have a plus blank to give myself space for completing the square. And I'm going to move that 12/5 away. So I'm going to subtract 12/5 from both sides. Okay. Then let's complete the square. So my middle term is negative 3t. Again, the t comes from the t squared, so let's focus on the negative 3. Half of negative 3 would be negative 3/2. And then if I square it, I'm going to have negative 3 squared, which would be 9, and 2 squared, which would be 4. So we're adding 9/4 to both sides to complete the square. And this one's going to end up a little bit messy with our fractions, but it'll be all right. On the left side, it factors nicely. So the square root of t squared would be t. Has a minus, since that's our middle term sign. And then the square root of 9/4, the square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 4 is 2, so it would be t minus 3/2 squared. On the right side, we do need to get a least common denominator to add our fractions together. 5 and 4, our LCD would be 20. I'm going to take the first fraction and multiply by 4 over 4, which would give me negative 48 over 20. For my second fraction, I'll multiply by 5 over 5, which would give me 45 over 20. Negative 48/20 plus 45/20 would be negative 3/20 equals our t minus 3/2 squared. To get rid of squaring something, we're going to square root both sides. So the square root and the squaring are going to undo each other. So I'm going to have t minus 3/2 on the left side. On the right side, let's go ahead and try to simplify a little, okay? So when I take the square root of negative 3, I can take out an I, so that would be I square root of 3. And I take the square root of 20, well, 20 is 4 times 5, and 4 is 2 times 2, so I can take out a pair of 2's there. So then that would be 2 square root of 5. And don't forget that when you take the square root, it's always the positive or negative version of it, okay? From here, I hate to break it to you, but we are going to have to rationalize all of that because we've got a square root in the denominator, okay? So to rationalize, all I need to do is get rid of that square root of 5. So I can multiply by the square root of 5 over square root of 5, which would then give me plus or minus a positive or negative I square root of 3 times 5, which is 15, over, so square root of 5 times square root of 5 would be square root of 25, which is 5, and I'm going to take that 5 that I get here, multiply by the 2 on the outside, and get 10 in the denominator. Okay, so now that's all simplified, thankfully. And the last thing we have to do is get t by itself and add 3/2 to both sides. So t is going to equal positive 3/2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 10. Okay? If you really want to, you're welcome to get an LCD between the 2 and the 10 and multiply by 5 and 5 and get 15 plus or minus I square root of 15 all over 10. You can certainly do that if you'd like to. Okay? Good luck with these. Lots of practice. Be very, very careful with everything that you do. Okay? And have a great week, everybody.